Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. This is the second of two episodes that I did with Tim Carter on the Reformed or Calvinistic response to the problem of divine foreknowledge. Tim and I's conversation went quite long, so I split it up into two podcasts. So if you haven't listened to the first one, and that's last week's episode, number 17, go back and listen to that one because our conversation probably, well, maybe you could follow it, but it's not going to make as much sense as it would if you heard our previous conversation. And as with last week, I again apologize for the poorer audio quality of this one. My main recording device failed, and I had a backup one, and I went off the backup, but unfortunately that picks up an echo off of Tim, and the overall audio quality is a downgrade. So I've corrected that. It won't happen again, but my apologies to all of you listeners and to Tim. I wasn't trying to make his view seem less viable with an echo or something like that. So before I get into the second part of Tim and I's discussion, I thought I'd share some feedback the podcast has been getting here. First of all, Keith, who's a gentleman who goes to the same church as I do, he was talking to me about podcast number 14 that I did with Sarah Geis on why sincerity isn't good enough. And in that podcast, I quoted somebody where I said, at the time I didn't recall where the quote came from, but the quote was, "I don't agree with your statement, but I'll defend to the death your right to make it." And that's what I was arguing is the correct view of tolerance, and Sarah agreed. Well, Keith was asking me where that quote came from. So I originally thought it was from Voltaire, but when I actually looked it up, it's from a British author named Evelyn Beatrice Hall, who wrote a biography on Voltaire, and it actually comes from that biography, so even though it's often attributed to Voltaire, Voltaire didn't actually say it. And I actually haven't read enough of Voltaire to be certain about this, but I'm pretty confident that that's a fair summation of what his views are, but if you've read a lot of Voltaire and that's wrong, you can write in and correct me on that. The second bit of feedback I got was on podcast number 16, where I introduced this series I'm doing on the problem of divine foreknowledge, and I went through all the various main options that Christians have used to propose this. And in that, I made the comment that the open theist option is a relatively recent view. I think it came around with about 40 or 50 years here. And Elijah, who's a professional philosopher who's actually published on the problem of divine foreknowledge, he contacted me over Facebook and said that that's actually not true. And loosely speaking, the open theistic view is a view that only recently was the label open theism put on it, but it's actually been around in some form or other longer than that. What Elijah told me is that the term open theism, at least as far as he knows, was first coined by the Seventh-day Adventist theologian Richard Rice in a 1980 book titled The Openness of God, The Relationship of Divine Foreknowledge and Human Free Will. But, quoting Elijah here, prior to that, the idea had been written about and discussed since the Middle Ages and perhaps even as early as 321 in Chalcedonius. And then he linked to a open theism timeline from the theologian and philosopher Greg Boyd, who I've quoted in reference to the problem of divine foreknowledge. Greg Boyd's an open theist, that shows that the view, or things very much like it, have actually been discussed and debated far longer than the last 40 or 50 years. And if you're interested in seeing that timeline, it's up on Greg Boyd's website, or you could contact me and I'll be happy to send that off to you. So I was wrong when I said that open theism is only about 40 or 50 years old, and I'm happy to take that correction. And the third bit of feedback I'll share here also happened on Facebook. Back on Monday the 5th, March the 5th, I shared a post from the group called Philosophical Theists. That's a quote from Vincent Torley on animals, and that quote said, quote, "There appear to be several traits which are unique to human beings: self-awareness as opposed to mere awareness of one's body, autobiographical memory as opposed to a mere memory of past events, theory of mind or awareness of one's mental states and other individuals' mental states, the ability to create symbols, the ability to grasp abstract rules such as algebraic rules, high-order spatial relations, hierarchical rules, and causal relationships, the ability to distinguish between perceptions and reality, as we do when we say that although the earth looks flat, it is really round, and finally language. And that's from a book, I think, titled Animals, Abstraction, Arithmetic, and Language, or it might be an article that's a little unclear. And so anyhow, I just shared that saying, look, here's some reasons why we can think that people, human beings, are distinct from animals, although we're all biological creatures, we're distinct. And Tyler replied to that saying, what's a way to answer the argument that we can't say what animals are thinking, or if they even have thinking, since we cannot communicate directly with them? Therefore, it's a fallacy to say that animals don't have existential questions. I always answer with, it's pretty obvious a cat or a chicken aren't pondering on the meaning of life, but that answer doesn't satisfy for obvious reasons. Thoughts? So I replied to Tyler, and I'll just read it verbatim here. Well, in the broadest possible sense, it's true that we don't have direct access to the minds of animals, but this type of reasoning proves too much, as in the broadest possible sense, we also don't have access to the minds of other people. You don't know in any absolute sense what other people's thoughts are, or even that they have them. You can only go off of the signs and evidence you perceive, that is, what other people communicate to you through language and actions, and use this to infer that other people have minds like yours. This is the idea of philosophical zombies, i.e., what if everyone around you are not really other people who have thoughts, feelings, and personalities, but simply things that appear to be other people? How can you really know other people actually have thoughts? So, for any argument someone will make about our lack of access to animals' minds, I can make a parallel argument about our lack of access to the minds of other human beings. Now, the common sense response to something like philosophical zombies will be that it's just silly and ridiculous. Sure, we don't have access to the minds of other people, but there is a lot of evidence that other people do have minds. They use language in ways that make sense, they act and react like someone with a mind would, they claim to have minds, and so on. So, given that the overwhelming majority of evidence disputes the notion of philosophical zombies, I'm justified in thinking that other people do have minds. That's where the evidence points. And likewise, there is simply just no evidence in favor of the idea that animals think about existential questions, and there is evidence that disputes this claim. If animals did think about such things, we can expect that there would be some indication that they do this. When people are thinking about such things, they give us indications. That is, they tell us through language, they produce art, philosophy books, religion, and so on. Animals display none of these indications of existential and high-level abstract questions like people do. And further, it's been argued in the book Nature Red in Tooth and Claw that animals lack a sophisticated brain that allows for self-reflective thinking. That is, you and I can think about ourselves and what we are doing, and we can even think about the thinking about ourselves. We can abstract up a level, 2 levels, 3 levels, 4, and so on. Now, loosely speaking, this is kind of what philosophy is. But it seems that animals lack the aspects of the brain that allow them to do this, and with a possible exception of, say, some of the higher primates like the great apes, which might have that. But still, even with the great apes, you don't have any evidence that they do this. You don't have any indication. They aren't writing philosophy books and producing religion. That is, it seems, and the evidence indicates, that animals are just physically incapable of the same type of thinking that you and I as human beings are. So, in summary, this type of skeptical argument that Tyler was referencing there commits its proponents to problematic positions like philosophical zombies, and while there is no evidence in favor of high-level thinking in animals, there is evidence against that idea. Thus, if someone wants to claim that my dog can do philosophy or a bird questions the existence of God, the burden is on them to prove that. And Tyler and I are still in the process of discussing things on Facebook because he then asked another question about potential and actual, sort of a anti-cosmological argument, in that he's got an argument he's trying to try out that he thinks argues against God, and we're still discussing that. So that's some of the feedback I've been getting on the podcast here, and I really appreciate Keith, Elijah, and Tyler reaching out and asking questions. I love answering and asking questions because I love doing philosophy. So if you have any questions or want to give any feedback, please do. You can always reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or like several of the other people did, reach out over the Facebook group, The Examined Life with Phil, and I'll be happy to answer whatever questions you have. Now, I also want to start a new segment, which I'm not sure what I'm going to call yet. It'll be pretty short. I might call it like updates or more information. Well, after you listen to the segment, if you've got an idea of what to call it, write in, give me a suggestion, because I'm open to them for this. Anyhow, the idea is when some new information or a piece of news comes out that references an old podcast episode either confirming something I've said or disproving what I've said, something that sheds more light on a previous podcast, I'll just quickly tell you about it. So, back in episode 13, I talked about narrative bias, which is, loosely speaking, the idea that you're so in your own story, you're so in your own narrative, that you're just unable to see anything that contradicts or calls it into question. So you're such a political conservative that as far as you're concerned, nobody who's a political liberal or on the left ever has any kind of good point, things along those lines, and it works vice versa too. Well, anyhow, a prime example of this narrative bias was on display earlier this week on the Joe Rogan podcast. Joe Rogan has a very popular podcast that you can subscribe to or watch on YouTube. And on Monday, the 5th, at least that's when this podcast was published, Joe Rogan had on Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Twitter, Vidya Gata, who I'm sure I'm mispronouncing her name because I always mispronounce people's names, who's a high-level executive at Twitter there. And he also had on a journalist named Tim Pool. And basically, Joe and Tim were quizzing Vidya and Jack about Twitter's behaviors and policies. Because if you paid attention, it's a pretty well-known fact that over the last 5-6 years or so, I don't know exactly the time frame, but anyhow, Twitter has routinely censored conservative political and philosophical viewpoints, and for the most part kind of let liberal viewpoints just do whatever they want and run roughshod it. And there are some exceptions when somebody said something particularly egregious, they just censor them regardless of the political viewpoint. But it's been pretty well documented and evidence that if you're a conservative on Twitter and you say something they don't like or step out of line, you're going to have the hammer brought down on you. Where if you're a political liberal or leftist, you can really, really push quite a bit harder and you're going to get away with it. And so Joe and Tim were quizzing and kind of going after Jack and Vidya over the fact that Twitter has a well documented liberal bias. And both of these people were just unable to see this. Tim actually had examples where he could say your whole policy is biased in favor of the liberal position because if anybody takes this conservative position, you're going to automatically ban them. And you don't do it, or maybe not ban, but automatically censor them. And you don't do the same for the liberal position. And some of these are on contentious, controversial issues that are up for debate, and some of them aren't. But you just automatically assume the liberal position in your written policies and rules and censor conservatives for it. And it was actually almost funny to watch Jack and Vidya just obfuscate, equivocate, and really do everything they could to avoid admitting that that's what's going on. And they admitted a few times here, that wasn't enforced consistently, or that wasn't enforced consistently. But they would then turn around and say, but there isn't a massive problem. It's not like we do this all the time. The fact that you were able to find a couple of inconsistencies where we didn't enforce our policies in consistency doesn't mean we have a liberal bias. So if you wanted a good example of what narrative bias is, go listen to that podcast. Go watch it on YouTube or something, because those two people from Twitter are egregiously displaying it. They are so blind to their own bias that they literally cannot see it when the evidence of it is presented right in front of them. So that's a very good example of narrative bias. Go check it out if you have the time. I think the whole podcast was like 3 hours, so if you don't have the time, I can certainly understand that. So, with that done, let's get on to the second part of Tim and I's discussion on the Reformed answer to the problem of divine foreknowledge.
Okay. Well, I think we probably discussed that about as far as we're going to get with it now. So why don't we move on a bit? You mentioned where, I forget exactly how you put it, where the knowledge that God has comes from, or where's its source. Is that, you were getting at that earlier, right?
Yeah, when we talk about foreknowledge, different ones try to address, how that is that God knows. Obviously, from the compatibilist side, we would say that God, set forth a plan in motion, and his plan is going to be accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how he knows what's going to take place. And then there are others that give out different explanations. Do you want to share what some of those explanations are?
Yeah. I wanted to get you to, if you could, comment on some of the other approaches people take to this. And that's kind of a part of the first one that I talked about there, is the the solution to it called Molinism, which comes from the medieval Jesuit philosopher theologian Luis Molina, which more or less, is like what you're doing there, it kind of reverses it, where it says, God knows what I'm going to do tomorrow because I'm going to do it. I'm not going to do it because God knows it. It reverses it, so to speak, by going off of a concept called middle knowledge, which you can kind of say it simply as, God knows all of us so incredibly well that he knows exactly what we're going to do, no matter what scenario we're going to be in. And God being God, he knew that from the very beginning of time, even before all of us were born. So what he did is he put us all in scenarios where we would freely choose to do the thing that he wants us to do. And the example I used to use when I was able to drink a lot more coffee in college, as I said, when I'm on a road trip, when Phil's on a road trip and he stops at a gas station, you can know he's going to get a cup of coffee, because that's what Phil's always going to do, because he just loves coffee that much. Now, sadly, now that I've gotten older, I can't do that as often anymore, because you can't drink as much coffee as you get older. It's pretty nasty effect of the evil in the world, I guess. But it kind of worked then when I was back in my 20s, in that you could just know Phil so well that you would know that's what he's going to do. And so this Molinism kind of takes that idea and expands on it greatly and says, well, God knows that about everyone, not just about coffee, but about everything. So the example I used in the last podcast is, God wanted Paul to write Romans. And he knows what Paul's going to write if he's in the city of Rome, and he knows what Paul's going to write if he was in, say, Jerusalem or Alexandria instead. So he just arranged the world so that Paul would be writing Romans in Romans, so it would be in Rome. Well, maybe he didn't write it in Rome. That's not important for the analogy anyway. But just so that Paul would write Romans where he was, so that way Paul would freely write what God wanted him to write. And so that's what Molinism does. It kind of reverses it, like you were saying. So how would you respond to that? What do you think of that as a solution?
I don't think it's a very good solution, to be honest.
Well, I didn't expect you would like it based on what you said before. But
I think middle knowledge is a lot of, and please know this is not an attack on anybody that said that holds this view. I'm simple and straight to the point. A lot of needless philosophical gymnastics to come to an answer to a problem. And I say that because at the end of the day, you're still left with a form of determinism, but it's been watered down, because the reason, if God knows all the possible outcomes and all the choices, and he arranged the world in such a way that people would act freely to get the outcomes that he wanted, he's still determining what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. So I don't see how you get away from determinism on that. And secondly, I think, it's almost Arminian in the sense where God is basically looking at how people respond, and then based off of people's responses, that's how he's creating the world. So it almost puts man at a higher level than God in the determination of the world and its creation, how things are going to lay out and play.
Well, I wouldn't say it puts man at a higher level, but it definitely puts more emphasis on man than the Reformed position does. No question about that. Definitely the case.
But, in a sense, isn't God submitting to man's will in Molinism?
Well, I think that what they would probably want to say is it's not like that you could say it that way. They probably wouldn't. They'd probably want to say something more like he's honoring God's will, but that's kind of analogous there. But that if you actually want to have free will, that's the way it goes. Where if you were like, if I want to honor my daughter's free will, I'm going to have to accept the fact that she's going to make choices I don't like, because that's just the way it goes, is how they would respond to that. But I want to go back to something else you said, where how it just kind of is still deterministic, but pushes it back a bit, where I think that's a pretty fair critique. In fact, I took a Molinist position for many, many years until somebody said that to me more or less as well. You've really just pushed the problem back a little bit because God's still determining things. He's just doing it in a more abstract, slightly complicated fashion. And I realized, well, yeah, that does kind of seem to be the case. And so I'm actually not sure which position I would want to take on any of these things right now, which is probably part of the reason why I want to do these podcasts. Mm-hmm. But that was the critique that made me step back from Molinism, which I probably held for 5 or 10 years, mostly because I thought that analogy of how, well, if you just know someone so well, you know what they're going to do, makes a lot of sense, at least at a simple level.
Right. And, I mean, yeah. So, and two, you got to think of, well, if Molinism was correct, and there are worlds in which people exist that don't exist in other worlds, you would have to argue that, I would think, if you're going to argue for Molinism, that there are some people that would have existed that no longer exist because of the world that was choosing to be created, and because choices involved in life involved in procreation, and who's to say that so and so would have married somebody else in another life and they would have had different kids,
Mm-hmm.
So from that approach, you almost have to have an anthropology where man pre-existed creation, at least in the sense of a determined number of people and personalities pre-existed creation in order to be able to have that knowledge of how they would react.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the grounding objection, which is, well, we can imagine how things might be different like this. I could make an if-then statement like I did about me getting coffee at a gas station, but where does that come from? How do we ground that knowledge? And
right.
There's some, I don't recall them off the top of my head. There's some pretty technical responses Molinists give to that, and hopefully when I get a Molinist on here, I'll pitch that at him or her and get some responses, because I went through them a while ago, but I honestly can't remember them off the top of my head, which I'm sure my Molinist friends are going to be shaking their fists at me for that reason right now. But I'll get somebody on here who can have a chance to respond to that, because I'm honestly not sure what I think of that objection, because that's one of those ones where I think it might actually be answerable, but I just don't recall off the top of my head. So,
well, I think it assumes a lot, because, and then even still, God has to determine that person is going to exist for their choices to be in play.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's just so many things that could be picked apart with that whole approach. And at the end of the day, I don't think that approach really solves any problems. I think it just masks them, if anything. I don't know. I said a while ago that it's still kind of deterministic in a sense, but it's also still what I said before is it's almost like a philosophical Arminianism, where man still has a choice,
mm-hmm.
But it's just kind of masked. So I think it tries to play to both, but it fails at really addressing the problem. It just kind of to me, it just kind of masks and covers up the issue and doesn't really address it.
Well, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but typically the main distinction that's given between Reformed or Calvinistic theology and Arminian theology is that the Reformed one is going to try and put much more emphasis on God and his actions and choice, and the Arminian one is going to put more emphasis on man and his choices. That's more or less how I've understood it, at least generally. Is that as far as you're concerned, right?
Generally, when we're talking about free will, most of the time, and in our religious circles, when we're talking about free will, it comes down to the issue of salvation. And,
mm-hmm.
In predestination, double predestination, whatever you want to lay the terms out for. And, the question with that is, if there's not free will in that, then, is God really a loving God? if it's already determined, is sometimes the question that's thrown out there. I wrote it down here. I can't find it.
Oh,
in my notes.
No worries.
Basically, that's where really the heated discussion comes down to, is in salvation and how that plays out in that compatibilist framework. But I'm kind of getting away from the discussion. We can come back to that here in a little bit. But
yeah, that's fine.
Molinism, I just don't see how it answers it. I think it's more trouble to try to defend and understand than it's worth.
And it wouldn't move you at all if I told you that a Calvinist was responsible for reviving it in contemporary philosophy and theology.
No,
I didn't think so, but hey, I just always thought that was kind of ironic that some people don't know this, but it was Alvin Plantinga who was responsible for reviving the idea of Molinism in contemporary discussion on these things. He just kind of thought up the idea. It's in a couple of his books, and then he only later found out that Luis Molina had already written down the idea, which, as I said last week, was probably a bad day for him that he came up with this seemingly new idea, and then found out later somebody else had it first. But Plantinga is from a Dutch Reformed church and taught at Calvin College. He's a Calvinist or Reformed, however, in virtually every other sense of the word, except here. So,
right. And that too, like, you got to understand is, we throw around terms, and it's really easy to develop a caricature of terms and try to label everybody as that. But what you got to understand is, no one has a perfect understanding of any of this. We do our best to study Scripture and to responsibly interpret it and understand it. And we can get a lot right, but sometimes we get a lot wrong too.
Yeah.
And whether it's in the Reformed camp or whatever other camp you want to throw out there, there's going to be variance in these things. In the Reformed camp, you want to talk about another hot topic is eschatology.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And you got in the Reformed camp, you got all kinds. You got.
I think
viewpoints on those things, and so.
I think I've dissented from the teaching of eschatology that every church I've ever attended has had, where they've taught it, and I've been like, no, I think you've really got that wrong.
You're right. Well, even this is a sidetrack, but even within interpretive frameworks, like all millennialism, you'll find different Reformed guys fall into that camp, and other Reformed guys fall into post-mill. And even in that, the commentaries that are written just in the Reformed camp from both of those viewpoints, commentaries on Revelation and end time stuff, there's a lot of variance, and and that's kind of like what we're discussing here is we can see in Scripture how this plays out, how man can plan in his heart his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. We see it in Scripture, but we try to still understand it. And, as we stumble through this and try to understand it, we got to have grace for each other and realize that I don't have all the answers. Everybody else doesn't have all the answers. We're trying to work through this together and get a grasp. There's no need to go at each other's throats. There are some things we're fighting for, but if it's not clearly revealed in Scripture, I think we have to show some grace.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I would say that this is very much kind of a in-house discussion, and I think you can take any one of these 5 major views and be an Orthodox Christian. No question about that. Now, obviously, some of us has to be right and some of us have to be wrong, but I don't see how any of these 5 views affect your belief that Christ died for our sins and rose on the 3rd day and is the 3rd person of the Trinity. So
we hit Molinism. What's the next one?
The next one is it's sometimes called the Thomistic one because this was the view that Thomas Aquinas took, or the Divine Timeless one. And what this one is it says that God just sits outside of time. He's not bound by time like you and I are. He's kind of there's different ways of saying this. You can say that he's timeless in the sense that he always has been, or maybe he was. I think William Lane Craig says he was timeless before creation. Then at the creation of time, he entered into time, and after creation's done, he'll be timeless again. So there's various ways you can say this, but the idea is that God is somehow separate from time. He's not bound by it like you and I are, where we're moving through time. And that solves the problem, because as God sits outside of time, he can just see what's going on, like you can when you're reading a book or watching a movie or something like that, where I've watched, say, my wife and I love the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I've watched it more times than I can count. I know how it's going to end the minute we put it in. But the fact that I know how it's going to end doesn't in any way influence how it's going to begin. And that's kind of a sketchy analogy, but the idea is God's similar in that sense, where his knowledge doesn't influence what's going on because he's outside of time.
So I have somewhat of an issue with that one, in the concept of foreknowledge and how it relates to omniscience. That would almost suggest that there was a time that God didn't know what was going to happen until he stepped outside of time.
Oh, well, I guess you could get around that by saying he's always been outside of time then, and always will be. Don't take William Lane Craig's view on it.
So you would say, from that point of view, you would say that when God created the world, at the same time, he was seeing the end.
Yeah, because time doesn't apply to him. It's sort. I guess you could think of it like this: if you think of time as a linear event, where it's like a ruler, where one would be the creation, and then the end of the ruler is the end of time. God's just looking at the whole thing all at once, holding it in his hand, and he's completely separate from it. He's not bound by it at all, but we are. We're stuck on the ruler.
So, from that point of view, then God would not he necessarily have to determine everything that happens in that time frame, or in that beginning to end time frame, in order to foreknow it before he actually saw it?
Well, I think so. That's you're just going right to all the critiques I usually make of these views. That's the critique that's usually made of that, is if there's a problem of divine foreknowledge, you don't really solve it by just taking time out of the equation, because the problem relates with causation, and causation is not time dependent, and you can prove that philosophically, because there's all kinds of ways of causing things that aren't time dependent. So if there is a problem, simply saying God is timeless doesn't fix it, is how that critique goes. And I've been talking with a philosopher friend of mine who's a Thomist, and I'll try and get him on here, and I'll see how he responds to that critique of it. So, yeah.
Okay, so what's the next one?
The next one is open theism, which I'm sure you've heard of, because it's a very, I don't know how popular it is in the sense of people who adhere to it, but it's popular in the sense that there's a lot of open theists writing books right now. Like Greg Boyd is one of them, and I actually really enjoy reading Greg Boyd's writing, even though I disagree with him all the time, because he's a good writer who's very clear and good at saying what he wants to say clearly. So what open theism tends to posit is that, well, we all want to say God knows everything, and the open theists agree. What they say is the future is not something that can be known. It's not settled. So we all say God knows everything in reality. He's omniscient. The open theists agree and then say, but the future is not part of reality. It's not settled. It's open. Hence the term open theism. So they kind of get around that by saying knowledge of the future is a contradiction. It's like a square circle or a married bachelor. Therefore, God can't know it because it's a contradiction. There's just no way. It's nonsense. It's not something you could even have a reference for. So God's omniscient, but he doesn't know the future because it's open. And I should specify, there's a lot of nuance in open theism. This is a catch-all term for many different views that are similar. In fact, I even think Greg Boyd has kind of rejected that term, but he does say he accepts an open view. He's wrote a book called, what was it termed? God of the Possible, where he actually argues for this. So what do you say to that?
I would disagree. So your open theism basically says that God, his knowledge of the future is not complete.
Well, it depends on which open theist you talk to. They would usually say it kind of like that, because my typical critique of it is, well, come on, I think I have knowledge of the future. The sun's going to rise tomorrow, isn't it? I mean, I don't know that in the sense that I absolutely cannot be wrong, like God does, but I certainly seem to know it in some sense. And so they will kind of nuance that a little bit in various different ways. But generally, they would say, yeah, God doesn't have complete knowledge of the future. He makes very good guesses, and his guesses are almost always right because, well, he's God. He's infinitely wise. So, of course, he's going to be right almost all the time. But not all the time, they usually say.
I would completely disagree with that one. I think that one has serious issues scripturally too, because you look at all the prophecies that you have in the Old and the New Testament. You look at God interacting with nations and peoples and telling them exactly what's going to happen, and even saying so much as he declares the ends from the beginning and why things happen. I think that just falls flat on its face when you compare it to Scripture.
Yeah, and I know what they would say to that is, and I'm not an open theist, so that's why I'm saying what they would say, is that that's God making very, very good guesses. Sort of like how if you and I were at a baseball game and it's the bottom of the ninth and one of the teams is up by 12 and the other one hasn't even made a hit all night, you might say, let's just leave. The team that's up is going to win this game. Well, you could be wrong, but come on, you're going to be right. It's 99 times out of 100, maybe even 999 times out of 1,000, you're going to be right there. And so they'd say, well, God does that. He's just a whole lot better at it than you and I are. So that's how we can make all those prophecies in Scripture and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Scripture completely contradicts that notion. Isaiah 46:10 from the Christian Standard Bible says, I declared the end from the beginning, and from long ago what is not yet done, saying, my plan will take place, and I will do all my will. I don't know how you get around that with the idea that God could be wrong about the future.
Yeah,
I just don't see. I don't see how that works itself out. I mean, you're essentially stripping God of his knowledge and power, in a sense, to know what is going to take place. And in that sense, he doesn't have control over the future. So, if you follow that to its conclusions, then how do you know that Christ will come back? How do you know that that it's going to end the way that it says it's going to end? I think that just opens the door for a whole bunch of problems.
Oh yeah. I'm inclined to agree with you. I'm more just kind of trying to say what I think of how an open theist would respond, because I studied the view for a while because I find it philosophically fascinating, because what it attempts to do is say, get around the problem by defining knowledge of the future in sort of an idiosyncratic way. Kind of like how I said before, I think the Reformed tradition defines free will in an idiosyncratic way. I think open theism defines knowledge of the future in an idiosyncratic way that's odd. And so I find it a fascinating view to study and read about. And, well, the other reason why I read about it a lot is I just really like reading Greg Boyd's writing. I think he's a good writer, even though I think he's wrong about a lot of things he says. He's a good writer that I enjoy reading. So that's
right. Yeah, I mean, I think that just I think that's just a dangerous position to hold, and unbiblical, and I don't know that I would classify that as orthodox.
Oh,
because I think it just it causes a lot of issues for a lot of what I would think important doctrines and teachings. So.
I think it definitely has. I do think it has some problematic implications where I think it could easily lead you into some contradictory viewpoints where you would have to hold some things. My dad used to say you would have to hold things in tension. But that brings up a whole other issue as to whether or not you can believe things that are contradictory, in the sense that you believe something that undermines a key doctrine of Christianity, but you also believe that key doctrine, which is a whole other complicated issue, which probably we shouldn't get into, because that we'd never finish this if we did that. So, where I found,
What's the next one?
well, I was going to say, where I found open theism has the most track is kind of in an appeal where people will say, well, in fact, I think Greg Boyd even tells a story like this in one of his books. This person suffered after doing all the things that God told them to do. Like, I think the example he used is there was a young woman in his church who married a young man, and they were both going to go off and be missionaries, and like all the signs were there that it was going to be. Everybody was seeking God. Everybody was acting appropriately. There was no reason to think it was going to go badly. And then the young woman's husband has an affair or two, falls away, and they wind up getting divorced. And I think this is even the story he tells at the beginning of the book, trying to introduce the view. And she comes to him and says, well, why would God put me through this? You know, I was seeking to follow his will. I was trying to do everything right. And look what happened. Why would God do this? And Boyd's response then is, well, God didn't do this to you. Your husband did. And God didn't necessarily know that that was going to happen, because Boyd has that open view of the future. And so that's where I've actually found that it gets the most traction, is in responding to things like that, where somebody would want to say, well, why would God do this to me? And an open theist can then turn around and say, well, God didn't do that. He didn't know. He's doing the best he can for you.
Right. But even that contradicts Scripture in Romans 8, where all things work together for the good of those who love God. And, you know, when we look at, where is it out here? In Romans 8:28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. So I would say that God has a plan. He had a plan even in that terrible situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, the whole idea that God didn't know, from the perspective of the open theist, is clearly unbiblical. That would be my stance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't agree with this view. I'm just trying to give it the best representation I can. You know, be fair.
Right.
Where, like,
oh, no,
yeah,
and I understand that too. But I just want to, you know, while we throw that out there, I think we also need to throw out why it's not a good option.
Oh yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd agree with you there. Like, going back to my podcast on the problem of evil that you and I talked about all those months ago, how I would say that to a person like that who's going through suffering is a kind of a different matter. But what I would want to say to justify the fact that's going on is, I'd be like, well, humanity killed God. We crucified Christ. And that brought about more good than we could possibly imagine with grace. So, if that much good can come out of something that terrible, don't you think it's possible or likely that some good can come out of the fact that this poor woman's husband was so terrible to her? I really think so. Now, how you say that to somebody who's going through that kind of suffering is a different matter entirely, and I wouldn't be very good at that, because I tend to be very blunt and undiplomatic. It's one of the flaws I have, as my wife constantly tells me, and other people have told me too. But that seems to make a lot of sense, both philosophically and theologically to me, where if you can point to the most evil thing people have ever done and say more goods come out of that than we can really even comprehend, then of course something really good can come out of a lesser evil. So, Okay. Well, moving on, the next response, and I don't really know how popular this one is. I think it may be more of an academic than anything else, but I could be wrong about that. It's called the simple foreknowledge view, and that essentially posits that while God knows the future, he's unable to change it or affect it in any way. This is, I'm quoting somebody here, This is called simple foreknowledge, for it holds that God simply knows what will take place, but cannot alter it in light of this knowledge. The fact that God foreknows what will occur does not increase his control over what occurs. So by analogy, I read this comic a while back, and they made a movie out of it, which was kind of mediocre, called Watchmen, and there's a character in it called Dr. Manhattan, who's their Superman character, who's essentially they're like a divine-like being because he's so powerful, and he sees all of time simultaneously, but he sees it in a deterministic way where he can't change any of it. He's just going through the motions. Everything in the universe is another cog and another cog and another cog, so even though he knows what's going to happen, he's powerless to change any of it. So what this would do is kind of make God like that Dr. Manhattan, as best as I understand the view.
I think that has a problem, though, because if that basically takes God's control of all of time out of play, where he has no control, what happens is just going to happen. And it's almost as if everything that's happened is already determined, and God is, unable to decide what's going to take place. It's just going to happen.
Yeah, you might say this is even more deterministic than a Reformed view is.
Yeah, it takes away God's freedom to actually create and do what he wants to do and accomplish his will, like we have seen in Scripture, and like he says he does. So I just don't know. I don't know how. I don't know how he would know without creating it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. So,
yeah, the only
can foreknowledge exist with God's will without God's will enacting on the future?
Mm-hmm. The only way I think you could maybe even possibly make this work is you'd have to say that God essentially baked everything into the world at the very beginning, the first moment of creation, where everything was determined from exactly that point. And he didn't even intervene once since then. It's sort of like the watchmaker, a deistic God at that point. But since we're Christians, we're also saying that God not only set up things and then never intervened, he set it up so that it would look like he was intervening, like when he had Moses parting the Red Sea and Christ coming and things along those lines. But those can't really be real interventions. At least it seems that way to me. And again, maybe somebody who holds that view will come in and correct me and say, no, I've got it wrong, which is the whole point of doing this. But yeah.
Yeah, actually, I just think that it just creates even more problems with that answer, with God's ability to act in his creation. It's almost sounds kind of reminiscent to like the watchmaker theory, where God just kind of creates and steps back. What happens, and doesn't interact in time. But I mean, clearly we see throughout Scripture where God does interact in time, does intervene, and I don't know. I don't think that answer is sufficient.
Yeah, I didn't expect that you were going to, take care of it like any of these other views, because I already knew you were taking a Reformed view, which is why I had you come on and talk about that. So,
Right.
But that's kind of the point of this, is not just you explaining the view you take, but saying, well, here's why I don't care for the other views, and then later on I'll get other people to say the same things about, say, the Reformed view. So, Okay. Well, moving on, you said you'd gone through the notes that I sent you. What did you think of my proposal that I put out last week, that maybe there isn't any contradiction at all? We could just deny the whole problem by looking at what the nature of knowledge is and what the nature of free will is.
I would somewhat agree. You're kind of coming in my direction, it sounds like.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, I don't think there's a contradiction. And like I said, we can see in Scripture where man is morally responsible for his actions, that man plans in his heart to do something, but ultimately God is the one that is there me find that scripture again. Like the heart of man plans his ways, and but the Lord establishes his steps. Proverbs 16:9. So I think the compatibilist really, I think that's the argument essentially. At least for me, is it's not a problem. I don't see a problem with the divine foreknowledge when I read Scripture. I don't. Maybe it's just me. I don't have to understand that because I know what the Bible says and I know that it's true, and I know that doesn't sit well for a lot of people, but who cares? It's God's word, and even the cross is foolishness to those who don't believe. So, I think sometimes we strive to answer these questions, and we should seek ways to try to clearly articulate what we know about God and reality through the study of Scriptures to those around us, and try to evangelize them. But there comes a point sometimes, I think, too, where we go too far and try to appeal to their questions and try to come up with great answers to questions that we can't come up with great answers to. It's easy to get caught in that cycle, I think. So I would agree that maybe not 100% with kind of your framing of the argument, but that they don't contradict each other because man is acting as he wants to act, and God is working out his plan at the same time. In man's, from Scripture we see that man doesn't seek after God, and God has to intervene in order for man to want to seek after God. In order for man to come to salvation, God has to step in and give man the faith to believe. In that sense, yes, God is changing the person's nature so that their will be changed to desire God. Because until that point, they're a slave to sin. They have the heart of stone, not a heart of flesh. And God has to change that individual in order for them to desire to come to God and desire that relationship with Him. So I would argue from that standpoint that that is actually more loving of a position than God allowing man to freely choose what he wanted. Because if God allowed man to freely choose what he wanted, man would just go to hell because man's not going to choose God.
You don't think that you and I chose to follow God? I do.
You did, but God changed your heart in order for that to take place. You had to have the gospel. You had to have the power of God at work in your life in order for you to come to that knowledge of Him and to give your life to Him. Faith is a gift, and my belief in God is a gift from God, and it's not a work that I've done. So He had to intervene for it to happen. If He would have left me and not intervene in my life, I would still be an unregenerate soul, a person, a sinner, dead in my trespasses of sin. Until God gave me life, I was enslaved to sin. But now that I've experienced a rebirth, I can now follow God, and I am now able not to sin, where before I was not able not to sin.
Okay. Yeah, and see, I get what you're saying. What you're doing is taking the kind of Reformed approach and saying, well, it's all God. And what I would kind of want to say is, well, it is God, but it's not, I have to respond to it. It's similar to how I was saying, well, it's not just one or the other. I want to say it's kind of both, whereas, well, yeah, I can only come to God because God invites me, but I respond. It's both in what I would want to say, not just one or the other.
Well, I would say that, you would not choose to respond unless God did a work in your life, gave you the faith to believe. So your response is evidence of the work that God has done in your life, is what I would say.
Oh, well, I don't deny that. That's absolutely true. Yeah. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying it's both, not just one. So.
Well, and I guess, where the disagreement might be is God, it was all of God, but yes, now that I've been reborn, I then desire to take that step of faith and believe.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. So, yeah, I have an action in that, but that action doesn't take place until God radically changes me, gives me new life, and gives me the faith to believe.
Yeah.
And so I would say it's, salvation is all God, but the evidence of my salvation is the action and the repentance and faith that follow what God has done inside of me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, yeah, I don't want to trivialize what you're saying, but it almost sounds like our disagreement is kind of more of a well, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Which comes first, the my decision to respond to God's invitation, or God's grace enabling me to respond to His invitation?
Yeah, I mean,
or maybe you could say which is primary, not necessarily which comes first in a time or causal sense, but which is primary, which is of more importance.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I didn't expect coming into this that we were gonna fully agree about everything, which is totally fine because, hey, if you only talk to people you agree with, you'll never learn anything. So don't do that.
Right.
I've told people on this podcast many times not to do that. So, well, I think we're about out of time, but one thing I've started doing, thanks to some good advice my wife gave me, is I've started asking people what's some kind of a, I don't know, philosophically or theologically odd idea that they have. So do you have anything like that? What's something where if you were at a philosophy or apologetics conference and you said, yeah, I think this, you might get some weird stares from people. Do you have anything like that you're willing to talk about? Or just to say, yeah, I think that?
Man, I don't know. Let me think here. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah, I got nothing.
No worries. So, okay. Well, are there any, if people wanted to learn some more about the viewpoint you're taking, what are some, books or lectures or teachers you'd recommend they seek out?
If you're wanting something kind of contemporary, James White has a book called The Potter's Freedom. That's a good one. It was written in response to Norman Geisler's book. I can't remember what it was called.
Geisler has a bunch of books. I wouldn't know it off the top of my head.
Let me look here. I should know this. Chosen but Free was what Geisler wrote. That's James White responded to that book with his book, The Potter's Freedom. That's a good one. If you're wanting to get a little bit more deeper into the whole discussion of free will, Bondage of the Will by Martin Luther, it would be a good one. Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards, and those would be good places to start. Also, R.C. Sproul has a good book on Reformed Theology that kind of lays things out. That's really concise. They used to, I don't know if anymore, but on the Ligonier website, they were for a time giving those books out for free.
Oh, okay.
On Reformed Theology. I don't know if they still are. I got one mailed to me. Just had to put your information in. So you might check on there, Ligonier.com, I believe, or I think it's .com. Yeah, Ligonier.org, LIGONIER.org. They've got good resources and provide some stuff from a reform perspective. As far as listening to people, if you go on Sermon Audio and search for Alpha and Omega Ministries, James White, he has a lot more extensive teaching on this stuff, and you can find all the good resources there. And I encourage you to go there and find some of that stuff. So that would be my recommendations for right now. If you're looking for an easier systematic to kind of dive into, Wayne Grudem's systematic theology is another Reformed perspective that would be readable. It's a lot bigger if you're wanting to bite off a lot, but it's another good one.
Okay, good deal. And I know you'd already plugged the Kallberg Institute. Do you guys have anything coming up that you are excited about or want to talk about just briefly?
We've got a few things in the works. This last year we had our first Polycon conference.
Yeah, I was there. It was a good time.
You were there and had a good time. You came to my breakout session on mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we got connected. We are in the works of planning that for next year. We've got some ideas that we're throwing around and doing a little bit more in-depth apologetics workshops on top of a Polycon. And maybe trying to offer like an apologetic certificate or something through Kallberg Institute for just lay members and people that want to come and they don't want to bite off and get into a college degree, but they want to learn more. We're looking at ways to provide some of that and kind of some weekend conference type style things, some a little bit more directed teaching on apologetics and defending our faith. On top of that, we've got the Tag Your It podcast. You can find all that on our website at Kallopoulos.org, Kallopoulos.org. It's KIALOPOLIS.org. You can find the podcast on there. We also have a blog that we're working on, getting it up and going. It's easier to read a blog than it is to create a blog.
Yes.
We've had some good posts from some guests. It was nice. Dr. Doug Grotice was our first post on the blog, and he was very generous in helping us out with that.
Yeah, Grotice is a great philosopher. I couldn't recommend his books more highly. So.
And he's got a great apologetics book that I would recommend to anybody. I believe it's called Christian Apologetics.
Yeah, that is a wonderful book. I use it for reference all the time. Mm-hmm.
That's a great book for anybody to pick up. It gives a full spectrum kind of approach to apologetics, and it's really helpful. But yeah, so we got the podcast. I would really encourage people to go on there. And if you like it, please go to iTunes and give us a good rating. If you don't like it, please don't do anything.
Yeah. Likewise, if you don't like my podcast, just don't do anything.
Yeah. But David Van Dover and Adam Cochran have done a wonderful job with the Tag Your It podcast, and I'm thankful that they are joined us with the KI. And looking forward to some big things that we've got planned for the future. But those are the things that we've got going on right now. Like I said, we've got some books in the works, but those are a little bit farther down the road.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to reveal too much on that right now. So
okay, fantastic. All right, well, thanks for coming on and talking to me and sharing your perspective on this, Tim. I really appreciate it. It was very nice to have you on again, and thanks for, like I said, coming on again and putting up with me and all my annoying questions.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Okay, well, now it's time for you guys to write in and let me know what you think. What do you think of the conversation Tim and I had? What do you think of his Reformed perspective or the critiques we've offered on the other views? Write and let me know. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and there's a Facebook group called The Examined Life with Phil. If you like what I'm doing here in the podcast, like the group and share it with other people so more people can learn about what's going on here, and hopefully I'll get some more feedback. And as always, if you have a suggestion for another Facepalm and Sigh Word of the Week, write in and let me know about that, because I really love doing those ones. Those are a lot of fun. Okay, thanks so much, and we'll talk again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.